Unlike this prayer of Paul in Ephesians 3, verses 14 through 21, I feel like a miserable failure when it comes to prayer, or at least depending on God with a sense of urgency for each day's needs. Do you know how embarrassing that is as a pastor to admit that that's a weakness of yours? It's not that I don't talk with God. It's not that I'm not in frequent conversation with Him. It's just that I realize every now and then that I'm not as dependent on God as I think I should be. And that probably means I'm nowhere near as dependent on Him as God wishes that I were. It's kind of like a little kid standing behind a car trying to open a tailgate, and they push the button and they stand there waiting for it to lift up all by itself. The only problem is that tailgate isn't an automatic tailgate. You have to actually lift it yourself. I have a hunch I'm not the only one in the room who wishes that they felt better about their prayer life. More than likely, you know how much you wish that you could improve that part of your life. Oddly enough, do you know the only thing that the 12 disciples specifically asked Jesus for was to teach them how to pray? Which led Jesus to respond with this: you need to pray like this. And that's when He reminded them to ask God for our daily bread. What we need, what He knows we need each day to sustain us for that day. The only problem is we may rotely repeat that prayer. We may think of it periodically. But as I'd mentioned before in the introduction, when our pantry's full, when our fridge is full, when our bellies are full, we don't really feel that compelled to go shopping again, do we? We've so insulated our lives that it's to the point where we don't feel like we have any needs anymore. And any needs we do have, we can take care of it ourselves. Honestly, for many of us here, life has been pretty sweet and comfortable, with doors that automatically open for us. The only thing is, this year, 2020, has taught us to look at things differently. We're starting to see things differently, and we're only halfway through the year. God only knows how we'll see things in another 6 months. Life is starting to feel out of control. COVID has interrupted the routines of our life. And as a result of the regulations and mandates, it's resulted in great suspicion and fear of others. The theme has been stay safe, stay home, stay away from others. Who can be trusted? The FBI? Oh, wait, they may be out to get you and set you up and send you to jail and bankrupt you. Washington politicians? The news media? Where's Walter Cronkite or any other one who would say, and that's the way it is on this day? What about the police? We've always been able to call on them and depend on them to do the right thing, right? Well, you've seen the news like I have. And now we find out we can't even depend on ourselves to just Google something and know that we're getting the right answer, or that if we look at something on Facebook or post something on Facebook, that it won't end up with us being accused of something that's not necessarily true, but because somebody else was offended by it or took it a way that we didn't mean it, we end up being blackballed and taken away. We can't even ask Alexa in our own home about something without wondering whether we're being eavesdropped on, or being able to watch TV without wondering who's watching us back. Racial tension and riots are threatening to tear apart our society and our civilization in ways that it's been decades since we've seen something like that before. One instant bad choice, one poor decision, and all of a sudden, in our cancel culture, the demands are there for you to be fired. I just read a news article earlier this week where a guy lost his job because of something his wife posted on her Facebook page. No wonder 2020 has made us start to look at things differently. The good news, though, is this, that God will not abandon those who are devoted to Him. It may come as a surprise, but God's power is within us. The world may seem like it's spinning out of control for us, but it also felt the same way for Jesus' disciples. Think back to Matthew 28. They just witnessed a crucifixion. There were reports of angels. There were reports of empty tombs and resurrections. There was political and military corruption. And there were lies that were being told even back then for bribes. Who do you believe? And yet in Matthew 28, verse 16, Jesus meets up with them just as He said He would, even though He had to come back from the dead to do it. And it says that when they saw Him, they worshiped Him. But some still had their doubts. In verse 18 and 19, His last thing that He tells them is, essentially, I want you to go change the world. Make disciples everywhere you go. How are they going to do that? Have you looked around at this ragtag group? A bunch of former fishermen, an accountant or two, a no-name brother whose only goal and only skill set seemed to be to go find somebody and make connections, a fixer, if you will. Understandably, that group of men were completely overwhelmed by what God expected of them. And yet Jesus promised them the power of God in their life. In Acts chapter 1, verse 8, it says, you'll receive power when the Holy Spirit comes on you, and you'll be my witnesses, telling people everywhere about me. Surprise number one may have been that God's power would work in their life. But the second surprise is this, that God's power is best seen when we are at our weakness. 2 Corinthians 12, verse 9, the easy-to-read translation phrases it this way, with phrases like this, only when you're weak can everything be done completely by my power. Or, the power of Christ works through me. Or, when I'm weak is when I'm strong. He would later address their comparison of His ministry with other, quote, super apostles, and he'd just say, I'm not enough. I'm not as good as other people. God's power is best seen in our weakness. But it's our weakness that makes us feel completely powerless. The Christians in a place called Ephesus would certainly understand how we feel today. Consider some of the context of chapter 1 and chapter 2 in Ephesians. In verse 1 and 2, it plainly says that they were followers who were faithful to Jesus. They felt the need for God's grace and God's peace. In verse 12 and 13, it talks about the serious racial tension that they were experiencing between Jews and the Gentiles. The good news that he shares with them is God saves all of us. It doesn't matter what race or what background or what ethnic heritage you have. We all need to be saved by God. In verse 17 of chapter 1, Paul prays that God would give them spiritual wisdom so that they can grow in their knowledge of God. In verse 19, he also prays that they would understand God's power for all believers. And it's the same power that was used to raise Jesus and bring Him back to life after the crucifixion. In chapter 2, verse 1 and 2, their life without God was a wreck. They were living just like the rest of the world, ignoring God and refusing to obey Him. In verse 11 and 12 of chapter 2, he reminds us that we can live in peace because Jesus is the one who unites us. The hostility that used to exist, creating that racial tension for them, was removed when Jesus died on the cross and united them in one body before the Father. He says all of us can come to the Father. It doesn't matter what our background has been. It doesn't matter how different we are from each other. All of us have the same Holy Spirit within us. And because of what Christ has done for us, we have equal access. We are equal citizens. We are all members of God's family together, forming one temple where God is worshiped. Paul even confessed in chapter 3, verse 7, that it was only by God's grace and power that he could share the gospel with them. So let's talk a little bit about how to depend on God in prayer. First, I want you to understand this. We begin by praying for His power to give us inner strength. In Ephesians chapter 3, verse 16, he says, I ask the Father to His great glory to give you the power to be strong inwardly through His Spirit. A different translation phrases Ephesians 3:16 this way, I pray that He would give you inner strength and power through His Spirit. That really speaks to us, doesn't it? Because we've all felt a lack of inner strength. We've all felt the need for something more than what we have. And the idea that we have an inner spirit in our physical body is one of the frequent focuses of Paul. For example, in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 16, the New Century Version phrases it this way, I pray, one, that Christ will live in your heart by faith. And the second thing he prays for is that your love will have deep roots. And the third and last thing he prays for in that passage is that your life will have a strong foundation. I pray that Christ will live in your hearts by faith and that your love will have deep roots. And I pray that your life will have a strong foundation. Think of it like this illustration. It's kind of like when you're as a parent, you're standing in a swimming pool and you're trying to encourage your young child to jump in who doesn't know how to swim yet. What do you tell him? Come on, jump, I'll catch you. Now your kid wants to be in the water. He sees you in the water. He sees others in the water. He wants to have a good time at the pool in the water with you. The only problem is, as much as he wants to believe you that you'll catch him, he still struggles to trust you, that you'll actually do what you said. Pray that we would trust Him when it comes to believing God really will do what He said He would do. Why is that prayer significant when it comes to depending on God in prayer? Well, first, because at times we have our doubts that Christ really does live in our hearts. We have evidence to make us question that. If He really lived with my life, if He was really in my heart, then why do I disappoint Him so much when I fall back into old routines of temptation and sin? If He really lived in my heart, why do I feel so guilty instead of forgiven? Or aside from me, what about what happens in the lives of others? What about tragedy that makes no sense? When people have their lives turned upside down, or maybe even their life comes to an end, and we begin to wonder and doubt, does God even exist? And if He did, then why didn't God show up like I think He should show up? Why didn't God show up like I thought He would show up? The second thing is this. It's a natural response to an inexplicable heartbreak. If there's really a God, why would He let this happen? It's not fair. Why should I bother trying to be whatever? Why should I bother trying to be the nice guy? Why should I bother trying to be God's guy if, like we all know, nice guys finish last? It's the squeaky wheel that gets the grease, right? It's the people that aren't kind, that aren't loving, but are heartless and ruthless. They seem to be the ones to get what they want and get away with it. And yet, if God's living in us, if the Spirit of God is within me, and I'm trying to allow Him to be seen in my life by being loving and joyful, by being a peace-loving person, by showing patience with others, by being kind when others are rude, by being good when others are evil, by being faithful to Him when it would be easier to just look the other way, and to exercising the self-control of the Spirit within me instead of just doing what I feel like or saying whatever comes to my mind and slips out between my teeth before I can bring it back. Why bother? You see, we need God's power for the inner strength to not just walk away and quit. Remember the immediate context for them there in Ephesus. They were living with tension between Jews and Gentiles. They were desperately praying for things to change. They needed love and unity instead of racial conflict. They were struggling because they were frustrated and tired of the constant turmoil. Does that sound familiar? As you watch your TV screen, as you read your news headlines and news feeds, if you're tired of living in tension, I mean, forget about Seattle or Portland or Atlanta or New York or even Columbus. If you're tired of living in tension in your own family, in your own house, and you're losing the will to be Christ-like because you're exhausted by the tension, keep on praying. How should I be dependent on God in prayer? When it seems like God's not there, or when it seems like God just doesn't care? Well, pray for His power to give you inner strength in the middle of that kind of tension and turmoil. But secondly, pray for love. Because life gets hard when your heart gets hardened by doubts about whether or not it makes any difference, by doubts about whether God is really there, by doubts about whether God really cares, by resentment because He didn't do what you thought He would do when you thought He ought to have done it. Let me read this passage to you in Ephesians chapter 3, verse 17. He says, I pray Christ will live in your hearts by faith, and that your love will have deep roots. I pray that your life will have a strong foundation. I know that you know that God knows how much He loves you. And I know that you should love others as well. But Paul also knows that hate and doubt can destroy your love and destroy your life. That's why he prays that their love will have deep roots, that their life will be built on a strong foundation. That's why his prayer is that the Creator God will recreate us with the inner strength that we need to overcome hate for others who are different than us and treat us poorly. We need a Creator to recreate within us an inner strength to overcome our doubts about God's presence or His character or His faithfulness. That's why he also prays that the Creator will recreate the reassurance of His love for us and in us that provides a solid foundation on which we can build our life. The only way that happens, to know that kind of love, is not by greater explanation, but by a greater experience. And that's why he says this in Ephesians 3, verse 18 and 19. I pray that you and all of God's holy people will have the power to understand the greatness of Christ's love, how wide and how long, how high and how deep that love is. Christ's love is greater than anyone can ever know. But I pray that you'll be able to know that kind of love. You see, when you realize that you can't do this kind of life on your own, you start to get desperate. And Paul prays that they'll understand that which isn't understandable, so that they can comprehend that which is incomprehensible and inconceivable. That's the significance and the place that relationships among believers come in, otherwise known as the church, whether it's the church in Ephesus or the church in Marysville. That's how we actually experience that four-dimensional love of God. How high, how deep, how wide, and how long. We can't see it. We can't understand it. It doesn't make sense to us unless we actually experience it in our relationship with each other in the body, the church. Because then when we experience love, it begins to resonate with us, and that's when it begins to click. How do you depend on God in prayer in a greater way? When it seems like God may not be there, or when it seems like He may not care? Pray for His power to give you inner strength. Pray for His love to keep your heart from getting hard. And the third thing is to pray for change. In Ephesians 3, verse 19, he says, "May you experience the love of Christ, though it's too great to understand fully. And then you will be made complete with all of the fullness of life and power that comes from God." You see, unlike us, Paul doesn't pray for situations to change. Unlike us, Paul doesn't pray for circumstances to change. Instead, he prays that God would change people. He prays that God would change their heart. And that's what happens when they actually experience that fourth dimensional love of God through the people of God. That's why he says in Ephesians 3:20, God can do so much more than we ask Him to do or we even think of. He does it by His power, which is working in us. Is there something in your heart that you've given up on ever being able to change? God can recreate that. Paul prays that people would become so confident of God's love because of what they've experienced that when they're ready to give up because of circumstances that never seem to change or that seem to be too big for them to be able to do anything about, it's a larger-than-life scenario, he prays that they'll refuse to quit because they know God's power and love are at work within them. And because of that, they can change who they are on the inside. Because of the power of God that gives us inner strength, and because of the love of God that keeps our hearts from becoming hard, when we face any conflict with anyone, and we find ourselves face to face with hate and sin and doubt and failure and guilt and fear, this is how we will respond. Not because we're so good or because we are living the life of Christ in a perfect way, but because of how it describes it this way in Ephesians 3, verse 21. "Now we offer up to God all the glorious praise that rises from every church in every generation through Jesus Christ, and all that will yet be manifest throughout time and eternity. Amen." You see, God changes us. Prayer changes us. And that's to His credit, not our ego, not our pride. We are desperately dependent on God for the only thing that matters in this life, changing us from the inside by His power, His love, and His recreation of who He intended us to be. May God bless you as you surrender to His will.